a lot of people in philosophy think that they should have theories about the nature of the world or the nature of the mind, and that your professional business in philosophy is to sort of provide some sort of pithy theory of these things. I tend to think that's ridiculously utopian. I mean, we're just not in that sort of situation at all.
Welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we are very pleased to welcome Professor Daniel Stoljar. He is Professor of Philosophy at Australian National University, and his work focuses on the philosophy of mind, physicalism, philosophical progress, and other issues. His books include Ignorance and Imagination, The Epistemic Origins of Consciousness, Physicalism, and Philosophical Progress in Defense of a Reasonable Optimism. He also has a variety of published articles. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome Professor Stoljar. I hope I'm pronouncing that as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I wanted to start with a few questions relating to your somewhat recent book. I guess it was from 2017 now, on philosophical progress. And when I talk to a lot of people that don't, aren't educated in philosophy or have a serious interest in it, I do often get the criticism that, look, philosophy doesn't make progress. It hasn't made progress. It's somewhat useless in that regard. And that's, of course, something you want to push back against in this book. What would you say to quell this person's worries about philosophy as a discipline?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's not only people outside of philosophy who ask that question. It's also people inside philosophy, of course. There's quite a lot of philosophers, amazingly enough, who think that philosophy doesn't make any progress. One thing I would do is to push back on it is to try to clarify a bit what we mean by progress, and point out that progress can mean lots of different things in lots of different contexts. I mean, so you can use the word, we use the word all the time in a kind of everyday sense, where you're just performing some task and you can ask, how much progress have you made? And that just means, how close are you to achieving your goal? So if you tell your kid to clean up their room, and you can ask an hour later, how much progress have you made? It's a perfectly reasonable question. But what those sorts of examples tell us is, first, as I said, it's a completely ordinary notion. But secondly, it's relative to an aim. So you need to make sure what the aim is to assess whether something has made progress or not. And sometimes when people say, philosophy doesn't make any progress, they usually mean that it doesn't help much with very straightforward practical aims. It doesn't, build bridges, or doesn't produce COVID vaccines or something like that. And that's of course true. I think one should just agree with that. It doesn't have, at least in a very straightforward sense, it doesn't have any of those practical applications. But of course, a lot of that isn't unique to philosophy. A lot of that's true in the sciences and in history, and lots of other sort of intellectual activities aren't quite aimed in that sort of straightforward practical way. But if you say, well, have we made progress in terms of how much knowledge we have about philosophical topics, then I think if we look closely at the discipline and look at its history, then I think it's true that we've made some progress. We do know more about philosophical topics than we do in the past, and we sort of build on what's gone in the past, rather like we do in other subjects. It's very important that we keep the right comparison class in mind too. I mean, often people think, it hasn't made any progress, even thinking of it as a kind of science, or thinking of it as a kind of intellectual activity, because you compare it to, say, physics or mathematics or something. And I think it's true that it hasn't made progress in the way that those disciplines have, but those disciplines are kind of off the charts. So it's sort of, if you just compare it to lots of other disciplines, like archaeology or linguistics or something like that, then I think we've made reasonable progress. So that's some of the ways in which I'd push back against that way of thinking.
Yeah, awesome. So, like, to play devil's advocate a little bit, I feel that like someone could grant that, okay, we know more about these philosophical topics in a way, but that's also philosophy. It sort of generates its own discussions, right? We have our own um, the sort of problems that get generated. We can talk about those and learn more about those, but we're not really making progress in understanding what the world is like. In other words, the progress we make is just kind of not really substantial, and that it's not really progress in the way that a scientist might make progress in learning about the world. I mean, this is something that people sometimes say.
People do say that sort of thing. It's true. There's various points here. Some points are, look, what seems to happen in philosophy is that it may be true that you answer certain questions and they generate other questions, and then it looks as if you've just got a lot of self-generated kind of questions. I think one could take that attitude about pretty much any science or any intellectual discipline as well. It's true in lots of fields that you ask certain questions and you raise certain other questions. So that by itself isn't much of a reason to think that philosophy is different from the other sciences, that it doesn't establish things about the world. I think that, one of the issues here is that there are people, of course, who think that you don't make progress in the sciences in general. And a lot of the arguments that people use when they focus on philosophy are very similar to those arguments. And there are sort of self-generated issues. They don't sort of apply to the real world or something like that, meaning something like the social world or the practical world. But it's not clear at all that philosophy is a different kind of case from these other kinds of cases, that there's a sort of clear distinction between philosophy and science on these scores. So that's another way in which I would push back. Unless it's just a kind of prejudice, but if somebody has a kind of reason to say something about philosophy making progress, you should always check to see whether an analogous claim wouldn't be true in the case of other kinds of modes of inquiry. And if it is, then there's nothing special about philosophy. If it isn't, then okay, then we've got something to look at. But apart from that, it's that's another way in which I guess I would push back, namely to see whether philosophy is any different kind of enterprise from anything else. I mean, in a certain sense, it's just trying to come to know about, we're just trying to come to know about certain topics just as we do in linguistics or archaeology or many, many other fields.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, you talk about the self-generation. That's sort of a better statement of the point I was trying to make, where the problems might be self-generated in some cases. And DE in the chat said that, yeah, and a way to think about this is that sort of criticism is that, like, we're not doing anything more than making things up or giving interpretations of various fictions or different things that we different questions that we ask and so forth.
On the bit about making things up, I mean, it's true that people sometimes say that about philosophy. It's just, you're just basically making it up. But, I think in the practice of philosophy, I mean, if you talk seriously about it, it's very hard to sustain the idea that people are just sort of making it up. I mean, if you just pick some argument or line of reasoning, you can deny a premise, of course, and you can ask whether the premise supports the conclusion or something like that. But if you really examine these things seriously, it's very difficult to sustain the idea that people are making up. At least if by making it up you mean the kind of thing that normally happens when you mean people are making it up.
Right.
And certainly, I think unless it's a sort of general skepticism about, what you might call rational inquiry, just sort of sustained or organized inquiry into some topic, unless it's some general skepticism about that, it's hard to see why philosophy in particular should be singled out here. On the point about looking at fictions and possibilities, it is true that in philosophy, people are interested in possibility and in possibilities in a way that perhaps they're not in some other fields. I think that's probably true. So we are interested in, different sort of possible systems or different worldviews or something, and exploring those worldviews in a way that you don't quite get in other fields. I think that is true. So that's one of the reasons why. I mean, sometimes people ask about philosophy why it studies its own history in the way that it does. Like, why do people bother reading kind of Aristotle or Kant or something when in physics nobody bothers to read Newton or something like that? Why is there that difference? And I think one of the answers to that, it's a good question, but one of the answers I think is that in philosophy people are interested in possibilities and in possible systems and how systems hang together and what happens if you adjust the system this way, if you tweak this, what happens, and if you tweak it that way, what happens, and so on. Those are kinds of questions that people are certainly interested in philosophy. And that isn't true in other fields. But it doesn't follow from that we're not making progress. First, because we know more about the systems than we did in the past. And second, because it doesn't mean that we can't come to know what the truth is about the actual system of the world and how it works and so forth. And in fact, examining alternative systems might be a good way to find that out. So I think there are some differences between philosophy and other fields, but I think at the level of abstraction that people are operating at when they think about progress, do we know more in the past? Do we know more now than we did in the past? I think it's very hard to see a difference between philosophy and other fields.
Yeah, that seems reasonable enough to me. When I think about this notion of like fiction and giving interpretations of things, I think of criticisms people sometimes have of certain areas of like theology and sometimes what's called more speculative metaphysics and stuff like that. People will talk about, well, what's the consequences of these particular views, or what are the different responses we can give to these various questions, when a lot of people think that, well, these things are like irrelevant. You're asking questions about things that have false presuppositions and so aren't really even relevant to the real world at all, or at the very least we don't have good reason to think that they are. And if philosophy or philosophers spends a lot of time exploring these questions and consequences, it's kind of just generating its own literature on presuppositions that are false or not well demonstrated, and that's kind of taken as a criticism sometimes. You kind of understand.
I mean, I think it would be a criticism if we weren't aware that the presuppositions were false, and then it would be, then there would be a problem. But if we kind of know perfectly well that the presuppositions are false, it seems to me to be a reasonable question to ask what follows from the presuppositions. And then in addition, of course, you'd want to know, well, to what extent if you're interested in, say, a particular worldview that you think has false presuppositions and how that worldview works, and what kind of view of, I don't know, morality or something it could sustain, it's one thing to ask that question, but I think usually what happens is that you want to bring it back to, our own situation where we don't have presuppositions that are false, or at least not that we believe that are false, and then see what it teaches us about the position of morality or something like that in our own worldview. I think that's it. Also happens. I mean, that kind of thing happens in science too, where you set up idealizations, for example, that have false presuppositions, and you follow out the consequences of those things. And ultimately, you want to bring it back to what's happening in fact, and that's a perfectly reasonable method. But it doesn't seem that different from what's happening in philosophy, I think.
Yeah. All right. So user DE wanted to ask a follow-up question on this. If you're there, you can unmute.
Oh yeah, can I be heard?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this is such a hard question to answer. So I guess I respect you you trying to provide an answer for it, but it's something that's also obscure to me. This question of progress and whether or not it's meaningful. But the idea, I think, has something to do with. This is a philosophy itself. Like pragmatist philosophy is a philosophy itself. But I think a lot of it. Like a lot of my criticisms, for example, about making progress, or like maybe people think that we make moral progress. For someone who's like a moral anti-realist like myself, the notion of moral progress seems kind of nonsensical to me. Obviously, if there are no moral facts, then you can't make moral progress. Things of that nature. And so I think the idea is something similar to, if you have a position like that, which may or may not be like a pragmatist type of position. Because if you take the moral realist example as an analogy, you might say, there are externalists about moral motivation and stuff like that. And you might think that like, oh, if you're an externalist about moral motivation, then there's a sense in which these things are kind of like imperative in name only. And it's like a question, there's no real way to test it. It wouldn't make a really difference. Like if we got all the moral facts wrong, it wouldn't really make a difference to how we live our lives or whatever. The only thing that's going to matter, for example, is our moral beliefs and things like that. And so, and so I think the question really is something like, what they're asking for is, why should we think that philosophy is in any way a reliable guide towards truth? Which, obviously there's this there's the common sort of self-defeat kind of attestation. Well, that question is a philosophical question, so you're kind of presupposing that philosophy can make progress. But if we kind of dialed back that type of criticism and just accepted that the question made sense for the sake of argument, the question really is, I think, is why should we think that philosophy makes any progress towards truth? Because you might say, like, if there's a fictional lore and there's a lot of people giving different interpretations, they might say like, well, I think that, Harry Potter does this or Harry Potter does that, and they construct these worlds. In some sense, there's a question about like, okay, well, Harry Potter doesn't exist, so none of that stuff is actually true, so we're not making progress towards truth by giving these examples. And so that I think is really the fundamental issue that these types of people are going to have with philosophical inquiry is, how can we know that it's providing anything close to truth?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. Just let me say something first about the position of moral anti-realism you mentioned, and then say something else about philosophy. Yeah, so I mean, you could say, in the case of moral anti-realism, suppose that moral anti-realism were true and there were just no moral facts at all. You could say, well, in that case, there couldn't be such a thing as moral progress. That's true, of course, but there's a sense in which, if moral anti-realism is true, then we know perfectly well what the facts are. That is, there are no moral facts. So if you ask, have we made philosophical progress in establishing moral anti-realism, suppose that we had, then the answer would be yes, we have, because we've established that there are no facts here to be discussed. It's sort of, morality is kind of like astrology or something. And so that I think, if you could establish moral anti-realism, that would be a kind of philosophical progress in itself. Of course, what happens, even if you establish moral anti-realism, is that there are always these follow-up questions. Like if you establish that that there are no moral facts, it remains the case that people believe that there are. And we can ask what sort of social role or what practical role or something those beliefs play in people's lives. And often those beliefs play certain kind of relatively important roles, which we could then discuss. And those are follow-up questions. So I think the position of moral anti-realism isn't a good example, I think, when you're thinking about philosophical progress rather than moral progress. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I just I didn't want to lose the point when I was because what you said there was salient to me, because I think a lot of the people who make this criticism, this is just devil's advocate because I don't actually believe this, but a lot of people who make this criticism, there's this question like well, is philosophy just psychology? You know, because when you gave when you gave the example of moral realism, we still have these explanations about people's moral beliefs, et cetera, you know, and one might think that that's like an empirical endeavor. And so, you know, you can make predictions about that, whether or not you think psychology is a good science or what have you, is not really relevant. The point is that it enters this new domain where you're making progress in the same type of empirical sense. And so that's it's kind of like, what's the rejoinder to that question? Is philosophy just psychology, for example?
Well, yeah, so that's a good question too. So what I was just saying was that whenever you answer a certain question, there's usually a follow-up question. And in the case of moral anti-realism, suppose you, for sake of argument, answered the question about the reality of morality in the negative and said, okay, I'm a moral anti-realist. What would be a follow-up question? Something about the role of moral beliefs in people's lives might be one follow-up question. And yeah, so your a retort might be, that's psychology, not philosophy. Well, it depends a bit on what you mean by. I think in the background here are some. This is, I think, came up in the second part of your original question too. There's this idea that philosophy itself is not a reliable guide to the truth, and that sort of seems to presuppose that there's some sort of special method that philosophers use, which, or in this particular example, there's a special method that philosophers use that psychologists are not using, or something of that sort. I'm not sure that that's true. I think philosophy is distinguished roughly by its subject matter and its topics, not so much its methods. And you raise certain questions about the topics, and you can answer them, and you can move on to other questions. And you know, the question about whether it would properly be done by philosophers or psychologists is sort of somewhat of a social question, which I don't think we need to police too closely. I mean, there are lots of questions which are about psychology or about psychological states, which just as a matter of fact aren't discussed all that much in philosophy, in psychology departments. It's not that they couldn't be in principle, it's just that they aren't. Like, you know, in this case, questions about moral psychology, about what exactly the beliefs are, about what exactly their role is, and so forth, even granting that they're false, just for the sake of argument. Some of those questions are sort of empirical at some level and could be discussed in psychology departments, but there are also philosophical questions, partly because they're generated by an obviously philosophical topic, namely the nature of morality and how we think about that. So the sort of boundaries between philosophy and psychology and philosophy and other fields, for that matter, are in some ways not that important for me. And in fact, that's a good reason for being skeptical about these claims about moral progress. About philosophical progress, because often these claims kind of presuppose that philosophy is a kind of special, sort of separate subject from these other subjects, and that therefore one can, for example, say that there's progress in science, or you know, more broadly, you know, science and history or something like that, but there isn't progress in philosophy, and that sort of presupposes that philosophy is something special or separate from these other topics. And I guess I don't believe that. I don't think it has a different methodology. I don't think it has some different topics, but the topics tend to bleed into each other. So that's one of the reasons why I think that there's progress in philosophy. It just basically couldn't be that there's no progress in philosophy, but there is a lot of progress in, you know, neighboring fields. Yeah, I'm not quite sure if that responded to what you were saying, but
no, it's a hard question. I mean, it's a hard question to answer anyway, because it's like I was saying, you know, it always seems like those types of things rest on what we would call like philosophical presuppositions, you know. So I agree. Like for me, it's like hard to answer, but thank you. I won't monopolize your time. Thank you.
Well, let me just say also, you mentioned the Harry Potter example, and it's true. I mean, there's an issue about, you know, what's true in the world of Harry Potter, and could we develop, you know, this kind of fan fiction or something which kind of develops things that are true and adds things. And you could sort of think of philosophy in that way. And there are some parts of philosophy, that's true, that have that feature, as I mentioned before. There are ways of investigating worldviews where you know that the presuppositions are false, but you want to know, you know, what follows from them or how you might develop from them. it's true. There's an element of that in philosophy. There's, of course, an element of that in the sciences as well, as I mentioned, especially in things like model-based science. But the question is whether that's all of what's going on in philosophy, and I don't think that's true. I think we know more about the nature of conscious states and the nature of morality and the nature of knowledge than we did in the past. So the idea that we are in part investigating possibilities doesn't in any way, for me at least, undermine the idea that we're making progress.
Yeah, I think a lot of what drives the pessimism about philosophical progress is that people will identify a series of questions with philosophy, like what is the ultimate nature of reality in metaphysics? Or what is, we talked about ethics and both normative and metaethical. What is the basic nature of consciousness? And like, I think what people often want or expect out of philosophy, if it's to make progress on these questions, is to give a answer, for there to be some sort of consensus on how to respond. And in the absence of that, that's suggesting that progress is either non-existent or not substantial. That's kind of where I think some people come from, especially those not educated in philosophy very much, except from an outside perspective.
Yeah, that's true. Though, as I say, a lot of people who are educated in philosophy hold the same kind of view. So that's true. One of the things, by the way, just one of the things I try to do in the book is to kind of take up that idea that there's a difference in philosophy between what I call the topics of philosophy and what I call problems or questions about those topics. So that it's easy to think topics are in a way just massive questions or massively abstract questions, like, you know, what is the nature of consciousness, or what is the nature of morality, or something. And it's easy if you focus at that level to think that there isn't any progress in philosophy, because if you think, well, in the past people were discussing the nature of morality or consciousness, and now they're discussing the nature of morality or consciousness, and they're still discussing it, so that suggests that there's no progress. But I think that misses a distinction between what the topics are and what questions people ask about the topics. So that in the past, people, it's true, were interested in certain topics just as we are, or perhaps people in other cultures might be interested in sort of topics, the same sort of topics as we are, but they ask typically rather different questions about those topics, and often the questions that they've asked in the past have been resolved. So if you draw a distinction between the topics of philosophy and the questions that people ask about those topics, I think the situation in philosophy begins to look rather like the situation in other fields. You know, even in physics, the topics that people are discussing now are at some level of abstraction pretty much the same as the topics that were discussed, you know, in the past. And so if you just eyeball those topics, you might think, hey, there's no progress in physics either. So I think there's a sort of not comparing like with like here in the case of when you think about the relation between philosophy and other fields. You think philosophy is organized around these big topics, and what you're looking for is some sort of pithy answer to these massive questions. And since nobody's come up with a pithy answer, you conclude that there's no progress in philosophy. But I think that's a mistake, because you could do that pretty much with any subject. And so again, we lose the sense that philosophy is all that different from other subjects.
Yeah, that's a very good. That's a very good point. The physics example is actually something I had in mind. Like, I mean, we can like, physics is interested in what, among other things, what the overall structure of the world is. And if you say, well, you know, we don't have a complete answer. I mean, we have made some progress on that, I guess, but we don't have a complete answer in physics to that question, or on that topic. So does that mean that physics isn't making progress, or even isn't making progress on that topic? That seems to saying too much.
Yeah,
too
like
serious of a criticism.
if the question is what is the ultimate structure of the physical world, then physics hasn't answered that question. So you could say, physicists now haven't answered that question. Also, physicists in the past were interested in that question, they didn't answer it, so therefore there's no progress. That would be a terrible argument, because that question really is a sort of sets the topics of physics and what physics does, or at least one topic in physics. And what physics does is then answers certain questions or proposes certain theories about that particular topic. And it's true, it's established certain theories and moved on to others. But I think something similar is true in philosophy, actually.
Yeah, at the very least, we it's not that philosophy is any worse off than physics or other disciplines in this regard. Although maybe
in
there
that
are,
regard, yeah,
maybe there's some other sense in which it is worse off.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the success in physics is, I mean, the thing that's amazing about physics is its level of success, not so much that
Right.
other fields don't measure up to it. In the book, I call this the Babe Ruth point. I mean, the Babe Ruth point is you've got someone whose statistics in baseball are sort of off the charts. Now, the mere fact that you're a baseball player whose statistics are nowhere near as good as Babe Ruth's doesn't mean you're not a good baseball player.
Yeah, or you're not worth, supporting, or
Yeah,
exploiting.
right. Or it's just a mistake. It's just a sort of more or less a statistical error to think that because you're not as good as an outlier, you're no good.
Yeah. And we had a question from user 8.5 who was wondering, do you think there are any fields of philosophy in which progress isn't made? And do you think that more progress tends to be made in certain fields of philosophy than others? For example, some claim that progress isn't made in metaphysics or first order ethics. Or for another, some claim that philosophy of mind is a field in which it is easier to make progress because scientific discoveries have direct bearing on many of the debates.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I don't really have developed views about this. I mean, once you start thinking in the way that I am about saying, well, there are all these, once we distinguish the topics from the questions we ask about the topics, once we focus pretty clearly on the various questions and what would count as answers to the questions, is it the case that in some areas of philosophy there's more progress than others? I tend to focus on some areas of philosophy mainly because I know more about them, so I can sort of speak with more authority about them. But it's hard to say that there are some areas that are some areas that are sort of doing better than others. I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical about the idea that, let's say, philosophy of mind is doing better than metaphysics, because in philosophy of mind, it's closer to some sort of empirical, various kinds of empirical questions than in metaphysics. Partly because, as I say, it's not as if there's some difference from a methodological point of view, from in sort of at least at a certain level of abstraction of empirical work and other kinds of work. So I wouldn't be inclined to rely on that point. It's also, while it's true that in philosophy of mind, it's quite close to certain sorts of empirical work at certain points. In metaphysics, it's pretty close to certain kinds of logical work and mathematical work. And often people actually, when they try to think about certain parts of philosophy that are making progress and distinguish them from other parts, they focus not so much on empirical bits that are connected to empirical work, but bits that are connected to logic and mathematics, because they think, well, obviously in logic and mathematics we are making progress. So if logic is part of a philosophy, that's a part of philosophy, and that's got to be an exception. And in metaphysics, so it depends what area of metaphysics you have in mind, of course, but in lots of parts of metaphysics, it's very closely connected to that. So, yeah, I kind of have an open mind about this, and I don't really have terribly firm views.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I had a somewhat difficult methodological question. How do you think we can best make progress in philosophy? In other words, what what are some of the tools and methods we can use to really make progress more likely than not?
Well, I mean, one very clear thing, I think, is being terribly clear about what question it is that you're addressing and what would count as an answer to that question. I think that's very important, not only in first order philosophy, but in second order philosophy or meta philosophy too, because in the case of the issues about progress, as I mentioned, people often say things like, well, we're talking, people now are talking about the same questions as people talked about in the past. Now, notice that that means the same question is being discussed now as in the past. Now, that involves an identification of what question is at issue. And often it's not true that the same question is being discussed now as was discussed in the past. And so, in order to think about progress in philosophy, you've got to think about what you might think of as the persistence of philosophical questions over time, whether they're the same or different over time. And that involves the issue of identifying the questions clearly. That's a crucial thing you've got to do when you're thinking about metaphilosophy. But I also think it's a crucial thing you've got to do when you think about first order philosophy. There's just so much. I think I defend progress in philosophy, but I don't think that, every piece of philosophy is a sort of fantastic thing, or there's a sort of forward movement of ever upward or something like that. I think there's quite a lot of criticisms to be made of lots of attempts to do philosophy, and often the criticisms are quite simple. They're just like you haven't sort of said exactly what question it is that you're dealing with and what would count as an answer to that question. And that's really that's really a crucial thing that you need to make progress in any area of philosophy.
Yeah. All right. I think we'll move on to a different topic. So, you, of course, have a book from 2010 on physicalism as a metaphysical thesis. And I had a few questions on that. Oh, I see. User Chisholm is here. But anyways, one thing I found, I've always found strange is that, and this is something you explore in the book, is that there's been a lot of different views, radically different views, given the name physicalism, right? You trace back, you look at Carnap's view and Neurath and other people, and then more recent thinkers. And it just seems that why are all these views called physical or physicalism? Is the concept so vague that people can present a view and just aptly call that physicalism, or is it just that people are talking past each other? What do you think the source of this problem is?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I mean, I think once you realize that so many different theses have been called physicalism and materialism for that matter, why does this happen? Why don't people use use different words for an apparently quite different thesis? Of course, people have tried to do that in the past. I mean, the word physicalism itself was introduced by the logical positivists for a quite different thesis than materialism. And then what happened subsequently was that those positions tended to get blended together. And then a lot of people then used the word materialism for their contemporary views, partly because they thought that somehow they were the successor theories to older theories, which they realized were different, but nevertheless played some sort of analogous role in their philosophy. David Lewis says that. He says that you've got to sort of honor your so-called intellectual ancestors, which means he said that in the context of addressing the question of whether the thesis should be called materialism or physicalism. And the answer was it should be called materialism because that's the traditional name, and the thesis that is currently at issue is somehow the heir to that thesis. I think in some ways what's going on here is something similar to the issue that we were just talking about whether questions in philosophy are the same over time or whether they're different. I think sometimes people think that the same thing is true for various theses, that there's got to be some thesis here called materialism, which is somehow the same, as it occurs in different contexts or in different periods. It must somehow be the same thesis. It's just that people haven't managed to express it properly or put it, formulate it in words properly or something like that. And so that's the sort of image I think people have in mind. And so they think, there's got to be some single position that, Hobbes held or Democritus held or Smart held or something. And that's materialism. All we've got to do is try to formulate it clearly. And if you think that, then you'll think, there's just some single thing underlying this. Part of the point of the book, I suppose, of that book was to sort of try to undermine that and say, no, there's all these different theses, and we should be sort of, we can address them differently and talk about their theoretical role quite differently. But I suspect that it's this idea that philosophical problems and theses kind of, endure, which is the kind of word from metaphysics. They're kind of wholly present at each moment that they appear, even if their outer clothing somehow is different. That's, I think, an idea behind that. But that doesn't seem to me to hold water, but it seems to be in the back of people's minds.
Interesting. Yeah, so a thought I've had when thinking about physicalism, and actually other issues as well, is that maybe when a lot of people employ the concept, they don't start with some clear, definition in mind in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions or anything like that. We start by cases, right? We think, I see rocks. Okay, that's the sort of thing I'm calling physical, or the stuff out of which that is made, and we add other things, sort of, to the extension of the concept, without starting with the criterion for which things will fall into that extension, will count as extension. And then, when we put our theory hats on, we come back and think, well, okay, if we have all these things we're calling physical, maybe we start to have some sort of more general commitments. Can I give a principle that captures those intuitions and those attributions that we make? And then we start, this is where people go in different ways in giving different definitions of physical. Oh, maybe some supervenience, maybe some sort of entailing, maybe some sort of, maybe some semantic, says something else. And then people disagree about that. But if the starting point is the sort of a substantive definition of picking things out, starting with particular judgments of physicality as opposed to judgments of a principle, then maybe there is this somewhat common notion. Does this approach make any sense to you?
Oh, I think there's absolutely. I think there's definitely that element as well. I mean, you do start with certain paradigms of physical objects, like rocks and mountains and stuff like that, washing machines, and you, in a way, you take that as your kind of exemplar of what the world is like. I mean, this kind of happens like in Quine's book, Word and Object. He begins by telling you about the familiar, what he calls the familiar desk. And that's kind of the hero of the book. That's the physical object, which is the thing that he thinks is the sort of, it's the thing that's the sort of typical example of an existing object. And other things are going to have to be somehow assimilated to that model somehow. And the assimilation can then take various forms. But of course, while it's true that you can begin with these paradigms and then different people might generalize away from those paradigms in different directions, it's still true that it isn't quite clear what we've indicated when we've indicated one of these paradigms. So if you were a kind of Greek atomist like Democritus, and you indicated some rock and said, okay, this is a physical object, then you would have, in the background, you would have had a theory that said, not only is this a physical object, but it is made up of things that are, from a metaphysical or epistemological point of view, are pretty much just like rocks, only smaller. And so, in a way, it's perfectly fine to gesture at a rock and think that it is a typical physical object because it's made of things that recognizably are like rocks. But of course, if you don't hold that view, then it's much less clear what you've included when you've said that rocks are physical objects, because you can say, okay, a rock is a physical object, which of course it is, but if you go on to say, and its constituents, and everything that you require to explain it or something is also physical, then you've got a much more open-ended kind of class of properties, and it becomes much more difficult to nail down what it is that you're talking about. So you're right. Yeah, I mean, I think you're quite right that everybody begins with paradigms like this. And you're also right to say that people generalize away from the paradigms in different ways. But there's a sort of further element, which is that it's just a bit unclear what's included just in the paradigm itself.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. Like when people think of a rock as maybe it's a paradigm case, they don't want to just say, the example is not just telling us that rocks are physical. I mean, it's telling us that maybe the stuff out of which rocks are made are physical, or the type of thing out of which rocks are made is physical, maybe whatever that is.
Right.
And we've got that just raises more questions about what exactly we're committing to.
Right.
That we're counting as physical. Yeah, that's a fair point. But I think, I don't know, I still think there's some, even though there's more questions to be answered, there's some plausibility to the view that this is, at least roughly, how we often develop these concepts.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, when I say that in the book, I say, the main thesis of the book is that there's no version of physicalism which is A, true, and B, deserves the name. That's the basic thesis of the book. Now, meaning there's zillions of different versions of physicalism. There are some historical versions which certainly deserve the name, but we know that they're false for well-known empirical reasons. And then there are other things that you can define which might be true, but they can't possibly be physicalism because they don't classify the cases in any kind of intuitive way. That's the sort of line of argument. But I don't want to say that means that there isn't any notion of a physical object or even a physical property. I think there's a bunch of different completely coherent notions, and one of them is the one that you're gesturing at, which basically says, well, it's a rock. A physical object is a rock or some constituent of a rock or something that's brought about by those kinds of remarks, which is something like an object that has a certain typical profile of properties. Those are perfectly fine notions of the physical. If you're asking what is our concept of the physical or something like that, I think one could give answers to that question. The point is that one can't rely on those concepts to develop a theory of physicalism, where physicalism is supposed to be a theory about everything, developed on the basis of these concepts, and that's the point of the book there.
Yeah, actually, that ties into my next question, which had to do with physicalism as a thesis in the philosophy of mind. Because sometimes if people ask me, well, okay, if you're a physicalist in the philosophy of mind, what is your notion of physicalism more generally, right? Because if the mind is physical, you have to have some more general notion of what it is for something to be physical. And one response that I think is available is to say, look, I don't have this like general notion of what it is for something to be physical, but I have like cases of objects or sorts of objects or sorts of properties and so on, which I'm counting as physical, including brains and so forth. And I mean, that's enough. I mean, I don't even need to use the term physical. I could just talk about the things which I think are identical with or give rise to or whatever, or the basis on which these things, mental things supervene. And those are the things I might call them physical, but clearly the view is intelligible even if I don't have a more general notion of what the physical is. Do you think that's a fair approach, or do you think that not having a general notion of the physical is a serious problem for physicalists in the philosophy of mind?
I think sort of two things about this. One is, I think it's true that you can put a circle around a bunch of properties and say, okay, for present purposes, these are the physical properties. Maybe they're the ones in the case of philosophy of mind or something. Maybe they're the ones described in contemporary neuroscience or some other science or something like that. And you can then ask, relative to that bunch of properties, whether consciousness is included in them or bears some kind of appropriate relation to them. You can certainly do that. There's no problem from the point of view of clarity. That's a fine thing to do. There is a little bit of a problem from the point of view of significance, though, because suppose you answer negatively that consciousness doesn't bear the appropriate relation to that bunch of properties. Usually what happens in the philosophy of mind is that you're thinking about the person who infers from this. Your opponent is often not so much the person who thinks that that consciousness doesn't bear the appropriate relation to this bunch of properties, but is usually a person who thinks that consciousness is fundamental. It's a sort of metaphysically fundamental thing. And so it would follow from its being fundamental that it wouldn't bear any relation to this bunch of properties. But from the fact that it doesn't bear that relation to this bunch of properties, you can't infer that it's fundamental because the bunch of properties has been selected in a somewhat arbitrary way. So I think that you can draw a circle around a bunch of properties and proceed in that way, but I tend to think that it's going to be less significant in the end than the sort of language and rhetoric surrounding the problem suggests that it is. On the other hand, the point that I've just made shows that there's perhaps a sort of slightly related way or different way of formulating questions in philosophy of mind that don't appeal to the notion of the physical and therefore are not affected by the problems that we've just been talking about, various interpretive problems about the notion of the physical. Namely, to recast the issue as a kind of issue in metaphysics by just asking, well, really my question is consciousness a fundamental feature of the world or not? And that question can be asked independently of any notion of physicalism or the physical or anything else. It can be true, just as a matter of fact, that when people in philosophy of mind say that they're physicalists, what they really mean or what they intend to convey is that consciousness is not a fundamental feature. But the reference to physicalism seems kind of inessential there, or at least their basic point could be formulated without mentioning it. And so that's actually what I do. I do think that while physicalism itself faces huge problems of interpretation, and as I said, it's not clear to me at all that there's a version of it which is both true and deserves the name, I don't think that this has a kind of as much of a negative impact on philosophy of mind as you might have thought, because the questions in philosophy of mind can usually be formulated without appealing to the notion of physicalism, even though they very, very often are formulated in terms of the notion of physicalism. It's actually quite common in philosophy that you use a notion to formulate a problem, and it's very convenient to do so, even though, strictly speaking, the problem isn't really about that notion. A classic example is when you ask about personal identity. Am I the same person as I was 10 years ago? You ask. Well, that's a good question, But as many people have pointed out, it isn't really about the notion of identity, even though you use the notion of identity to formulate it, because the notion of identity is a kind of logical notion, which we understand perfectly well. And so whatever the question is, it isn't strictly about identity, even though you use identity to formulate the question. And I think something similar is true here. You could say, yeah, physicalism itself is in trouble as a thesis, because it's just incredibly difficult to formulate it in such a way that it could possibly be true and still deserve the name. But problems in philosophy of mind that we formulate in terms of physicalism are not as a consequence to be rejected, because those problems only make inessential use of the notion.
Yeah, really, some really interesting points there. Let's see. I wanted to get to this question from Base Cosmopolitan. So he's talking about. He says, it struck me when reading your section on actual theory of physicalism that while the twin physics idea is really interesting, it might actually be a counter possible. I'm not sure that it suffices to stipulate twin spins. We might think that, we might say this without subsequent commitment to physicalism even, I think. Actual theory of physicalism is actually pretty permissive. One can alter, say, the gravitational constant, or do some funky stuff with electrons and charge, and it'll still fit very plausibly within our actual best theory, and certainly be captured by the predicates of that theory. And two, therefore, the twin physics world, to be really such that it is not captured in actual theory of physicalism, is going to have to look really weird, and as such, probably can't be twin cases. Anyway, so maybe that kind of world is something we ought to be biased against until we have a firmer picture of it and how it might fit together. Possible world building is hard, of course. He goes on a little bit more to elaborate on that, but do you understand what he's getting at? I'm not.
Yeah,
exactly
no,
sure.
I do understand. So yeah, that's a terrific point, actually. So let's just back up a bit. So what I call actual theory physicalism is the thesis that the physical properties are the ones expressed by the true physics, the true actual physics, whatever that physics turns out to be.
And not just possible physics.
And not just possible physics, exactly. So it's the one that's the true physics, whatever that physics turns out to be. And actual theory physicalism just says, okay, I've got a bunch of properties expressed by that true theory, and those properties are the ones that singly or in combination determine all the rest. So in a way, this is a theory that meets the description we were just talking about. It draws a circle around a bunch of properties and then treats those properties as the sort of physical base that determines all the rest, given your physicalism. And okay, so the twin physics case is supposed to be a problem for this. And the idea is, it's a bit like Putnam's twin Earth case. You just imagine another possible world where everything from an observable point of view is exactly the same, but the physics is different, so that the physical properties that you end up with are different from the ones that are at issue in actual theory physicalism. And the intuition is supposed to be that in that world, physicalism is true, or at any rate, it's just as true as it is in the actual world. But it wouldn't be the case if actual theory physicalism were true, because actual theory physicalism gloms on to the specific properties that we've got in the actual world. And by assumption, in the twin physics world, the properties are different. And so the sort of underlying idea is that actual theory physicalism is like too specific. It says of certain possible worlds that physicalism is not true at those worlds, when intuitively it is. Partly because it's supposed to not matter for physicalism what exactly the details of physics are. Whereas on actual theory physicalism, that would. Now, the questioner says rightly that I think that actual physics permits a lot of variation within it because there's loads of things that can be defined. I take the point to be something like this. There's lots of different properties, even perhaps uninstantiated properties that can be defined using actual physics, whatever it. I mean, we're talking about a physical theory. We don't know what it is because we're talking about the true one, whatever it turns out to be. But no matter what it is, it can presumably define certain properties, even if they're not instantiated, and at any rate has a certain amount of variation within it. That's true. I mean, that's true. Nevertheless, I'm sort of thinking that a physical theory is some sort of, suppose you think of it as a bunch of propositions or sentences that say something like there's a certain kind of object or a certain series of objects and they have some properties. What properties they are depends a little bit on the way that the way that we interact with the world. So it's a sort of kind of externalist point, a bit like the one that's at issue in Putnam's to an Earth case. And if that's the case, then the properties at question, the properties at issue could be quite different one from the other, even though that difference doesn't show up all that much in their theoretical role. And as long as you accept that, then I think you've got a twin Earth kind of case, a twin physics kind of case, which would at least put pressure on actual theory physicalism, granting the correct point that that actual theory physicalism permits a certain kind of variation in what properties it is that it's talking about. I think that's what's going on in that question. I hope.
Yeah. I remember you talk about this in the book. I'm trying to recall exactly what you say. Some of the points you made here, you did make there, right? About how if we would state it too precisely, then it'll actual theory of physicalism will commit us to the view that these other worlds with slightly different physics are just are worlds at which physicalism is false. And then I thought you just left it off at the point that, well, maybe we can the actual theory can be not quite so committing or precise, and so it permits some variation in the physics without physicalism being false or something like that. Was that more or less the line?
There's a sort of a dilemma. So some of you may be familiar with this famous dilemma in formulating physicalism called Hempel's dilemma, which says something like, well, suppose we try to formulate physicalism using a physical theory or the properties expressed by some physical theory. Well, what Hempel's dilemma says is, well, do you mean the physical theory we got now, or the one that we might have in the ideal limit of inquiry, or in the future, or something like that, or perhaps just the one that's true? And the dilemma is supposed to be that if you choose the one that we have now, then nobody thinks it's complete. Even people who think that contemporary physics is true don't think it's complete. So that can't be sufficient for physicalism, which is supposed to be complete. If you mean the future physics or the ideal physics or something, then you face the problem you don't know quite what is included in it. So you don't quite know what things are ruled in and ruled out by physicalism. In the book, I was trying to, there are various issues that come up when thinking about Hempel's dilemma. But in the book, I was trying to use a dilemma that instead of talking in temporal terms about contemporary physics or future physics, rather I was talking in modal terms about actual physics and possible physics. And the general structure of the dilemma was, if you formulate your physicalism using physics that's actually true, regardless of whether it's the contemporary version or some future version, but if you do it in terms of the physics that's actually true, then you're going to end up with a version of physicalism that's too specific, in the sense that it'll count as non-physicalist worlds that intuitively are physicalist, and the twin physics world is supposed to be an example of that. On the other hand, if you loosen it, which of course you can, and say, well, okay, any possible physical theory will do, then of course you're going to count the twin physics world as a world in which physicalism is true. But the problem is that you're going to overgenerate badly and count as physicalist worlds where worlds at which intuitively physicalism isn't true. Perhaps certain kinds of panpsychist worlds, for example, might be an example of that, or perhaps just worlds where intuitively dualism is true. But the integration at the world is such that physics won't. The physics that's true at that world won't sort of notice. So the general idea is that physicalism faces a kind of modal dilemma in its formulation. If you choose actual physics, you're going to end up saying that physicalism is false at worlds at which it is intuitively true. On the other hand, if you use some sort of possible physics to formulate your view, then you're going to end up saying that it is true at worlds at which it is intuitively false. And there's just no way to thread the needle. That's the sort of basic idea of that argument.
Yeah, that seems like, on its face, a pretty good argument. So, user Chisholm had a question. If you want to unmute, you can go ahead and ask.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today. So I actually had to leave for a bit, so if this was already answered, let me know, and I can just rewatch like the recording. But when we have these sorts of disputes about what physicalism is, right? So someone might say, oh, I think it's the supervenience thing, and someone says, no, that could include God. Okay, I mean grounding, and that has this problem, and so on and so forth. And that's what all these sorts of some people were going to say that's what all these disputes kind of boil down to. There's a view of some people, at least, that all of this is like really just conceptual analysis, and that it's just a waste of time. That there's no real point in trying to find the exact correct formulation because people might not even have the same concepts. Do you think? I guess there's two parts to this question. Do you think that there's any truth to this? And two, kind of related to the beginning part of this AMA, what do you think the role of conceptual analysis is in philosophy? Some people are going to say, like as an extreme view, as an example, that just a necessary condition for philosophy is that there's this sort of conceptual analysis. Do you have any specific views on this?
Yeah, on the first part of your question, this hadn't come up actually, at least not explicitly. So good, thanks for asking it. On the first part of your question, I think it's sometimes people say, "Oh, it's conceptual analysis, and people have different concepts, and there's no way to resolve this." I think that's true in some cases. That's sort of plausible, at any rate, in some cases where the concepts are relatively ordinary ones. Like sometimes in philosophy, we're interested in sort of notions like knowledge or even a physical object or something. And these are ordinary notions, and we could engage in conceptual analysis, and it might turn out that different people have different concepts. In the case of physicalism, I always think, well, first, that's a slightly technical notion within philosophy. Even materialism is a slightly technical notion within philosophy. Of course, it gets used outside of philosophy too. But it's not quite the same as these ordinary notions, and so the sort of dialectic kind of argumentative issue around it is a bit different. So you might say, well, it's a sort of a technical notion, and though it is true that we have relatively established views in philosophy about under what circumstances it's true and under what circumstances it's false. I mean, everybody agrees that in the world that that Descartes believed to be the actual world, physicalism has kind of got to be true. Got to be false. I'm sorry, at that world, and at the world in which it literally is just atoms and the void, physicalism is true at that world. And so it's a sort of it's one of these situations where the community of users of the notion is a relatively constrained one, and moreover, I am a kind of a highly representative member of it because I am a professional philosopher, and they're the ones that are using the notion. So in a certain sense, I I feel that the usual issues about conceptual analysis, about whether there's cultural variation and so on, are somewhat limited in this particular context for that reason. On the more general question about what conceptual analysis is, it's never completely obvious. It's never completely clear to me what conceptual analysis is supposed to mean exactly. I mean, the critics of conceptual analysis think of it as a kind of psychological project about saying how people think about causation or morality or knowledge or something, and then they say, I think in the background is the idea that when people, think about causation or morality or consciousness, they have some sort of tacit or tacitly known definition or something. And the idea is to try to, elucidate that. And then they go on to say that, in philosophy, people don't do this correctly because this looks like a psychological project. And, for psychological projects, you should set up experiments and compare different populations and so on and so forth. Proponents of that's the way that conceptual analysis is kind of imagined by its opponents as a sort of basically a piece of psychology. But often defenders of conceptual analysis don't think of it as a piece of psychology. They think of it as, while it's true there's a reference to both concepts, which sound psychologistic, and analysis. Really what you seem to be doing when you do conceptual analysis is answering questions like, answering non-psychological questions about what things are. Like, what is knowledge, or what is causation, or what is morality? And actually, we know from semantics, we know how to deal with questions of the form, what is X? What those questions usually are asking for are, they're asking for certain properties of X, certain, in fact, contextually relevant properties of X. So what is causation? You might mean, well, we all think of it as some sort of relation, but what kind of relation is it? Is it a relation that supervenes on the regularities of the world, for example, or is it a relation that doesn't supervene on the regularities of the world? That might be thought of as a kind of analysis of causation, but it could hardly be, it's not sort of psychologistic at all in its orientation. Often when proponents of conceptual analysis have, what they have in mind is something that isn't like that. So I think on this issue of conceptual analysis and whether it's right or whether it's wrong, there's a lot of sort of talking past each other, because the critics think of it as a psychologistic kind of issue and then go on to criticize philosophy for not doing psychology correctly. And one might, push back against that, I suppose. But setting that aside, the proponents of conceptual analysis basically don't think of it as a piece of psychology at all. They think of it as just answering questions like, what are these things? And that isn't psychology at all. So that's kind of where I am on the conceptual analysis issue.
Okay, thank you. And could I ask just one quick clarifying thing about the first part of that answer?
Sure.
So you were saying something like the disputes about physicalism are going to be a bit more maybe formal, in so much as so I wanted a little bit of maybe a bit more on that. So like if I have some notion, you might want to call it an intuition or whatever about what it means for something to be physical, and say I don't have like a really strong analysis. I don't have the sufficient and necessary conditions, so I can't just appeal to some rules. But I have some intuition about what physical means, and someone say gives me some new kind of object that I'm not familiar with. Like let's say I've never heard of what an essence is, and then someone comes along and says, "Okay, here's what an essence is. On your view, on your understanding of physicalism, is this physical or not?" Am I going to be just appealing just to the intuition? Do you think when I sort of sort through the kinds of things that I should be committed to being physical?
Yeah, so this is a question about the notion. So one thing I try to do is distinguish between questions about interpreting physicalism and interpreting notions of the physical. When I was saying before about its being a somewhat technical notion, I meant physicalism as a somewhat technical notion. But you're right that there's a notion of the physical which perhaps isn't technical. Now, when the question at issue is, suppose you have some sort of notion, and you're presented with some new thing, like an essence of something, and asked, and the question is it physical too? This is sort of like a kind of Wittgensteinian question about, how to go on, how to apply your existing notion to this new case. And I don't sort of have, I don't have a sort of specific answer to this question. It depends a bit on what the rules are that you had when you what your dispositions were when you used the notion of the physical in the first place. I mean, sometimes, for example, the notion of the physical applies, I sort of say this a bit in the book, applies to physical objects rather than to properties at all. So in talk about physicalism, we very naturally start immediately talking about physical properties. But actually, in ordinary talk, physical seems to apply to objects like washing machines and rocks. So in other words, the word physical seems to some extent a bit like the words for color, like yellow or blue or something, which apply to physical objects in the first instance, and not so much to properties. Properties are not blue or yellow. And likewise, you might think there's a sense in which properties themselves are not physical at all. Physical is a word that applies to objects. And from that point of view, you might think, well, how do I go on when I'm asked whether some property or an essence is physical? I don't know, because the word applies to objects, not to those things of that category. Now, it's a bit peculiar that in philosophy, it's one of the sort of mysteries of the interpretation of physicalism, that we've moved so quickly to notions like physical properties. But one might get very, very huffy about this and think that actually that makes absolutely no sense. So I can sort of go back and forth. You can sort of imagine a view that says yes, we can extend it to certain kinds of essences or not. It's very hard to say in the abstract.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for that. And we had another question from user 8.5. If you want to unmute, you can ask a question.
Hey, thanks so much for participating in the AMA. I have
No worries.
I have a question about formulating physicalism, and what I'm basically wondering is what a certain debate will look like, or maybe the debate won't survive at all if we accept your view about the thesis of physicalism, which is that there's no statement of it that's either true or deserving of the name. So the debate that I'm thinking of is one where you have two different views on it. The one view is Hawthorne's view, where he thinks that if a certain statement of physicalism were such that it's compatible with the possibility of blockers, where he has like a precise understanding of what a blocker is, then that would show that the thesis isn't physicalist. And his reasoning is that physicalism about the mind anyway would require a tight connection between the physical and the mental. And if your thesis says that blockers are possible, then there isn't that tight connection. But then on the other side of the debate, you have, I can never pronounce his name, but I think it's Leuenberger.
Stefan Leuenberger.
Yeah, Leuenberger. So he has the complete opposite take on this, where in his view, physicalism, whatever it is, it's in the first instance supposed to be a contingent thesis. And he thinks that requires that at least when you're saying what the thesis is, that it should be compatible with it, that blockers are possible. And he thinks that this is an advantage of certain statements of what physicalism is. For instance, formulations from Jackson and from Lewis, and then maybe a disadvantage of other formulations of it. So what I'm wondering is do you think that this is one of those debates that pretty much just collapses once we accept the view that there's no interesting way of saying what physicalism is? Or is it the kind of debate that could be maybe recast in slightly different terms? And a related debate would be, for instance, whether or not you think physicalism is compatible with there being like a fundamental totality fact. So I think Leuenberger says no, because if there's this fundamental totality fact, it's not grounded in the physical. Physicalism isn't compatible with that. But when you read Jackson and Chalmers, when they talk, they put it in more epistemic terms about like what's deducible. Like they put in the base like indexical knowledge and a totality fact. So I'm just wondering, like questions like those, like is physicalism compatible with the possibility of blockers? Is it compatible with the fundamental totality fact? Can those survive like rejecting the idea that physicalism is a meaningful thesis, or are those like more merely verbal issues?
Well, I think they're neither. Actually, I think they can. Sorry, I think they can survive the issues we were just talking about. But they're not also. It's not also right to say that they're merely verbal. I think think about it this way: the issues that we were just talking about have to do with interpreting the notion of the physical, and whether we can get any contemporary version of physicalism that is true and deserves the name. But setting that aside, we can certainly imagine versions of physicalism that seem intuitively true. Namely, let's take, for example, the atomistic world, the world where Greek atomism is true. And at that world, where there's literally just atoms in the void, that's a world where physicalism has to be true. Now, one can ask about that world all of the questions that you were just gesturing at, or at least versions of those questions. So you can ask relative to a world like that, or at least a world of that type, what would happen if there were blockers in that world, or not? Would physicalism still be true in that world, or not? Maybe Hawthorne might say no, and maybe Leuenberger might say yes. Or I think Hawthorne thinks that blockers, the possibility of blockers means that certain definitions of physicalism, even relative to those versions of physics, wouldn't be right, in particular the Jackson minimal physical duplicate idea. But notice that question still survives, even though we've sort of just stipulated away the problems about interpreting the notion of the physical that we were talking about a few minutes ago. So I think they still remain. I mean, in general, when you're thinking about physicalism, there's always two questions to bear in mind. First, what counts as a physical property? And second, what relation does everything have to bear to those physical properties in order that physicalism has to be true? We were talking, a lot of my skepticism about physicalism has to do with the first question. Not so much that you can't say what a physical property is, but you can't say what it is in such a way that physicalism turns out on any version to be true. But the second question is just granting a notion of physical properties. What relation does everything have to bear to in order that physicalism is true? So that's the place at which questions like blockers, the relation between physical properties and other things come up. And I think one can certainly raise those questions independently of issues about what physical properties are. On the issue of how to go, what to say about the blockers case, it's sort of hard to say. I mean, not everybody shares Hawthorne's intuition, actually, that the presence of blockers undermines the truth of physicalism, because they say, hey, it's still true that a minimal physical duplicate will be a duplicate simpliciter, just as Jackson says. And so that just shows that blockers aren't a problem. But at any rate, the crucial, the sort of direct answer to your question is yes, those questions survive the issues about interpreting the notion of the physical that we were talking about.
Do you mind if I ask a slightly different question that you sort of touched on earlier, but I just kind of wanted to follow up about it?
No, of course.
So asking about not necessarily physicalism, but whether or not something is physical. One thing I've always found kind of strange, and it sounds like maybe you find it strange as well, is that when you read certain introductory pieces on, for instance, abstract objects, um, views according to which, for instance, properties, propositions, and other such entities, if they were to exist, those would be abstract objects. You commonly find in a basic characterization of what an abstract object is, the claim that it's non-physical. But then, interestingly, when you look at the philosophy of mind, in particular, one of the paradigm examples of a physicalist theory of mind is the mind-brain identity theory. But that view is usually put as an identity thesis between properties. So, for instance, the property of being in pain on this view is identical to a certain neural property. But now there seems to be a kind of tension because in the philosophy of mind, our paradigm example of a physical property is a neural property. But then when you read this literature on abstract objects, it's held that properties would be a non-physical object because that's what an abstract object is. So I'm wondering what's going on. Is there, like, who has the right view here? Is it true that some abstract objects can be physical, maybe neural properties being one of the examples, or have the philosophers of mind just been sort of sloppy about what their view should be?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think what's going on is that the word physical is being used in different ways in the two contexts. So, I mean, in the philosophy of mind, you basically, in order to um, discuss the contrast between dualism and physicalism correctly, you need to introduce a notion of a property that's physical or not. That's partly for the reason I mentioned a few minutes ago, that is that physicalism itself is formulated in terms of properties. But it's also because there's a distinction between substance dualism and property dualism. Substance dualism is in effect a dualism of particulars. It says that there are certain kinds of or categories of particulars called substances which are non-physical. But then there's also property dualism, and property dualism says that while perhaps every particular is physical, there are some particulars that have non-physical properties. And as you said, the identity theory is usually thought of as direct opposition to property dualism. Of course, it's direct opposition to substance dualism too, but that's a further matter. The key point is to try to undermine the property dualist, and that's because a lot of dualists these days, to the extent that they are dualists, are property dualists rather than substance dualists. So you need the notion of a property or a physical property to understand that issue. If you didn't have that notion, you couldn't really see the difference. But you're quite right to say that often in talk about abstract objects, people often say that they're non-physical. What do they mean? And in particular, the notion of a property is non-physical. What do they mean? Well, I think what they mean is the word physical there means something like having a spatiotemporal location, perhaps being solid, being such that you could bump into it, that kind of thing. These are properties of physical objects, which abstract objects don't have, at least, allegedly. So the number 2 isn't such that it's located in space and time. It's not such that you can bump into it and so forth. You can't see it, etc. Whereas physical objects precisely do have those properties. When Quine was talking about the familiar desk, the desk is familiar in part because it has a spatiotemporal location and you can lean on it and so forth. It's solid. And numbers are not like that. So what we really mean is that when when people say that numbers or properties or propositions are not physical, they mean they lack certain properties that are distinctive of physical objects. That's, I think, what is meant in those sorts of discussions. Whereas in the philosophy of mind, what you mean is, well, properties are physical, meaning in the first instance, they are properties that are distinctive of physical objects, or perhaps they're the right kind of relation to properties that are distinctive of physical objects. That would be one way of doing it. So that, I think, is what's going on. In one context, the word physical applies directly to properties, and in another context, in the abstract object context, it applies directly to objects, and that's why you get this back and forth. But I think once you clear it up, there isn't really a contradiction here. One can say, in one breath that numbers are not physical, and on the other breath say that properties are physical, something like that. I think that's the way. I think that's what's going on. But I think it's a very good point.
Thanks. That was really helpful, and that's kind of how I like to think about it as well. But it was interesting to hear you go through the reasoning.
Okay.
All right, and we had another question from Nebu on consciousness, and this is something that comes up in one of your papers on the semantics of what it's like statements, where he's wondering what the relation between consciousness and attention is. Are we only conscious of that which we attend to, or are we only in a certain conscious state if we're aware in some sense that we're in that state? What do you think of this thesis? Is it plausible, true, or false?
Yeah, a lot of people do think that it's sort of obvious that if you're in a conscious state, you must be aware of being in it, or aware that you're in it, or something to that effect. Sometimes this is called the transitivity thesis. Well, I think, first of all, that there are a number of different notions of consciousness. I tend to be a kind of pluralist about this. There are different, just as there are different notions of probability and causation and so forth, there are different notions of consciousness. And it's certainly true that the transitivity thesis is true of one notion of consciousness. Like, we can certainly say that a psychological state that you're in is conscious if and only if you are conscious of being in it. I mean, the so-called higher order thought theory of consciousness is the sort of classical expression of that view, and I don't think there's any doubt that that theory is describing an interesting property of some states, which that property deserves the name conscious. I don't think I don't think one should object to that. But there are others. The fact is that there are other notions of consciousness as well, for which I don't think the transitivity thesis is that plausible. One of them is phenomenal consciousness, which is the one that's at issue mostly in debates about materialism and consciousness and stuff like that, and in fact debates about consciousness in the sciences as well. There, I think of that notion as effectively a kind of generalization of the ordinary notion of feeling. If you feel a certain way, then you're phenomenally conscious, or to put it more directly, a state of yours is phenomenally conscious if it either is a state of your feeling some way, or it's necessarily connected to your feeling some way. Now, I think for that sort of state, the transitivity thesis doesn't seem plausible at all. It doesn't seem obvious that when you feel a certain way, you must be aware of your feeling a certain way. Or at any rate, that would require a lot of argument. And so that notion of consciousness seems to be a notion which, as I say, the transitivity thesis doesn't seem obviously true at all. Some people argue that it must be true, of course, but I don't think those arguments are terribly good. So I'm inclined to say that as far as phenomenal consciousness goes, the notion, in other words, which is tied down to the notion of feeling, the transitivity thesis isn't true. Having said that, I agree that there are notions of consciousness, like the higher order notion, which is a perfectly legitimate notion, for which it is true. So that's roughly where I come down on this. There's, there are different notions of consciousness. For some, the transitivity thesis is obviously true. For others, it's not.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I tend to think about it in a similar way. So we're coming to the end of our time. So I think I'll end with a somewhat more general question about the philosophy of mind. And do you have a particular positive view about what the mind is? I'm not sure. I've read a bunch of your work, but I'm not exactly sure what your view precisely would be if you have one. So maybe just comment briefly. Do you have a positive view on what the mind is?
That what the mind is one of those, what I called earlier, a topic question. It's a sort of massive question, a bit like you're sort of asking what the nature of the world is, or what the nature of something is. I mean, I am a kind of person. I mean, a lot of people in philosophy think that they should have theories about the nature of the world or the nature of the mind, and that your professional business in philosophy is to sort of provide some sort of pithy theory of these things. I tend to think that's ridiculously utopian. I mean, we're just not in that sort of situation at all. What is true, when we think about the mind and the many other things in philosophy and in many other fields, is that what we're confronted with a literal infinity of questions, quite literally an infinity of questions. And we've answered some questions, and other questions we hope to answer, and we have reasonable hope that we will do so. Other questions are sort of, in the too hard basket. They're ones which we have absolutely no hope of answering, either now or perhaps even in principle. That seems to be the sort of general situation that we're in. And so when you say to me, what is your view of the nature of the mind, I tend to think, well, I can't really answer that question in general. I do think that, I think that the mind, I don't sort of have original views about this in a certain sense. I think obviously the mind depends on the brain. I think the brain wholly determines features about the mind. I don't think that we know how this happens, because I think we're ignorant of certain relevant features of the brain, even though the brain is a physical object, and that neuroscience tells us some things about the brain. I very much doubt it tells us everything about it, and I certainly don't think it tells us how the brain, in fact, yields the mind. So I just think that's basically our situation. As to general theories about the mind, I think some elements of the mind will not succumb to the kind of thing we normally have in mind when we think about scientific theories, which are really kind of mathematized investigations of empirical laws. I don't think that's going to be true of lots of areas of the mind, lots of aspects of our experiences and the way we take our experiences and so forth. I think rather that we're going to just be describing those things rather carefully. I think they're all true, but I think we can describe them. But I think that there are nevertheless some areas where it seems as if we have the prospect of empirical theories of the kind that I just mentioned. And maybe even in the case of consciousness to some degree. I mean, for certain kinds of abstract conscious properties associated with feeling, with the notion of phenomenal consciousness that I mentioned, one can provide empirical accounts of how they're related to, global access theories or something of that kind. I think those things are quite plausible. I don't, these are areas where my own expertise sort of trails off. So I don't want to necessarily make firm assertions about them. But that's roughly where I stand. I mean, to be honest, once the issues become more overtly empirical than philosophical, I tend myself to say, okay, well, now I can let someone else have a go. I'm not going to keep talking about it at that point.
Yeah, that's a good answer. In a way, this ties back to something earlier you said about the sort of satisfaction criteria not often being very clear. Like, what would it mean to give an adequate answer to what your general view on the mind is? I mean, is it enough to start listing off the properties you think mental things have, or the sort of characteristics of them? What sort of characteristics would you have to list for it to be an adequate answer? In other words, the question may not be so clear in what classifies a satisfactory answer. And I think that's fair. But yeah, overall,
I mean, philosophy is full of people who have sort of try to give some sort of complete theory of whatever topic that they're interested in, and maybe even a complete theory of the world or the totality of existence or something. And that just seems to me to be, as I said, ridiculously utopian. We're just not in any position to do that. And so whenever anybody asks you a question that looks as if it calls for that kind of answer, the correct thing to do is to not answer.
Right. Yeah, that's fair enough. So with that, I think we'll end up the questioning around here. Thank you so much for, first of all, being here and staying to answer all our questions. It's been excellent. I'm sure there are others that, including myself, who have more questions we'd like to ask, but we don't want to keep you forever. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me, and don't hesitate to email me with questions if you want to. I'll see if I can get back to you. Thanks very much.